He thought he was stood up on a date. Then his wife stormed in with the kids, uncovered his secret, and what happened next left the entire restaurant in shock. Have you ever witnessed a scene so raw, so painfully human, that it clings to you long after the moment has passed? I did, on an ordinary night at the restaurant where I worked, surrounded by the hum of clinking glasses and the faint scent of garlic bread. It began like any other shift, until a man walked in wearing a pressed button-up shirt and enough cologne to fog the air. He had made a reservation for 2, though only 1 chair was filled. He arrived early, 10 minutes before his table was ready, and I could tell by the way he kept smoothing his collar and shifting his gaze to the door that this evening meant something to him. Maybe too much. Every time it opened, his eyes sparked with hope, only to dim again when it wasn't her. I recognized that look, expectation curdling into dread. I'd lived it myself. Minutes dragged into half an hour. He scrolled through his phone, flicking the screen up with nervous, sharp movements. Notifications were absent. Texts unanswered. The silence from the other side of the conversation was louder than the chatter of the crowded dining room. When he finally sighed and asked for a large pepperoni pizza, his voice was calm, polite, but the fracture in it was visible to anyone listening closely. As I placed his drink down, I noticed the way he left his phone face up, as if daring it to light up and save him. The other servers whispered at the station, glancing over like curious spectators at a car wreck. I wanted to tell them to stop, but I didn't. Instead, I kept his water glass full, pretending that was an act of kindness when really it was my excuse to check on him. He offered forced smiles, too tight, too rehearsed. His napkin stayed folded. His food arrived untouched. The air around him grew heavy. Other diners glanced over, their laughter and conversation faltering as they caught sight of him, alone at a table set for 2. The sight of his untouched pizza felt almost cruel, a symbol of rejection cooling in the open air. He stared at it for 15 long minutes before finally taking a bite, chewing slowly, like each swallow was weighted with humiliation. An hour passed, then more. The restaurant bustled with energy around him, and yet his table was a black hole, swallowing every shred of warmth. Finally, defeated, he asked for the check and a box. Only 2 slices gone, and a look on his face that said he wished he hadn't ordered it at all. And then Nancy appeared, one of our servers, taking her break. She should have gone to the back, where staff usually huddled with phones or cigarettes. But that night, she crossed the room, slid into the booth across from him, and smiled like he wasn't invisible. I watched his entire body change, tension melting into something bright and unexpected. His eyes lit up. His laugh, hesitant at first, grew real when she teased him about something I couldn't hear. For 20 minutes they leaned toward each other, conspirators against the loneliness that had plagued him all evening. She even stole a slice of his pizza, and he didn't seem to care that his phone had stopped mattering. Around us, my co-workers nudged one another, grinning. For a brief moment, it felt like we were all watching the start of something hopeful, like the first act of a romantic comedy. But then, the front door banged open. A woman stormed in, dragging 3 children behind her, all in pajamas. The youngest clutched a stuffed rabbit, its ear dangling by a thread. Her fury filled the restaurant before her voice did, eyes blazing as she scanned the room and locked onto his table. Every sound in the dining room died. Forks clattered down, conversations stilled. His face drained of colour the instant he saw her. He tried to stand, but she was already at the booth, spitting fire before he could draw breath. "So this is what you're doing while your kids go hungry?" The words cut through the restaurant like glass shattering. The children crowded behind her, wide-eyed. The middle child sobbed quietly. The oldest, 10 maybe, fixed her father with a stare so sharp It looked like betrayal carved into flesh. Nancy shrank back, cornered in a drama she hadn't auditioned for. He stammered, desperate, but his wife wasn't listening. She pointed at the pizza box, then at Nancy, her voice cracking with rage and heartbreak. "You told me you had to work late. You swore there was an emergency meeting. I scraped together our last dollars for gas so I could find you, because your kids haven't eaten. And here you are, on a date." The youngest tugged her sleeve, whispering, "Mum, can we have some of Daddy's pizza?" The woman's face broke then, not in anger, but in something deeper. A wound splitting open in front of all of us, the kind that never really heals. The woman's fury cracked open into sobs, though her voice never stopped lashing out. She shouted about bills unpaid, children neglected, trust shattered into shards too sharp to gather back together. The man tried again and again to explain, stumbling over his own words, but every protest only deepened the disbelief etched across the room. Nancy, pale and trembling, finally rose from the booth, but before she could slip away, the wife lunged a step forward, blocking her escape. Her demand was sharp, almost venomous. How long? How many nights had they stolen while she sat home with 3 hungry children? The tension was unbearable, thick enough to choke on. My manager, Andrew, was already moving across the floor, arms half raised in surrender, like a man approaching a cornered animal. But before he could intervene, the husband's voice cracked through the silence. "She's not my date." His eyes glistened, his throat raw. "She's my sister, the one you made me cut off 5 years ago." The words landed like a thunderclap. For a suspended moment, the restaurant became a portrait of shock. Forks frozen midair, drinks untouched. Even the hum of the kitchen seemed to falter. The wife's jaw dropped open, hanging as if she'd forgotten how to close it. Then her whole body stiffened, hands slack at her sides, as though she had collided with something invisible. The children pressed closer to her legs, wide-eyed, the oldest shifting a gaze between father and stranger, with disbelief burning hotter than tears. He reached toward his wife, palm open, pleading, but she stepped back, bumping into their youngest, who clung tighter to her shirt. Nancy rose at last, voice unsteady, but loud enough for everyone to hear. "I work here." Her hands shook as they smoothed her apron, fingers twisting the corner of her order pad. "I've been here 6 months. I never wanted it to happen like this. Her glance flickered between her brother and his wife. "I just missed him, that's all. I wanted to see if he was still him." The wife's face flickered like a storm cloud breaking apart and reforming again. First confusion, then something like fragile recognition, then hardening back to anger, then cracking once more into hurt. Andrew approached slowly, palms outward. "Maybe we should take this to the office, folks. You'll have more privacy." Her head snapped toward him, eyes blazing. Her voice, sharp as broken glass, carried through the dining room, setting a baby at a nearby table wailing. "No, I want answers here, right now." She turned back to her husband. Her words came out jagged, splintered with pain. 5 years. 5 years you haven't spoken to her. Because of what happened. The man sank back into the booth, burying his face in his hands. His shoulders shook as his voice bled through his fingers. "You gave me an ultimatum after she borrowed money and couldn't pay it back. You said it was her or you and the kids. I chose you. I chose my family. But it killed me. Every single day." Tears fell to the table, darkening the wood grain. The children began unraveling, one sobbing harder, another tugging at their mother's shirt, the youngest asking in a small, fragile voice what was wrong with Daddy. Something in me broke. I grabbed crayons and paper from the hostess stand and approached cautiously. "Hey, guys," I said softly, bending to their level. Want to sit over here at a special table while the grown-ups talk? The youngest reached for my hand instantly, trusting. The middle child followed reluctantly, only when I promised a secret menu to colour. The oldest resisted, her eyes locked on her mother's, until finally the woman gave a small nod. I led them away, seating them where the storm couldn't quite reach. When I turned back, the wife's voice was high, cracking under its own strain. Her gaze locked on Nancy. "How many times?" The words were knives wrapped in grief. "How many times have you two met behind my back?" Nancy lifted her trembling hand and showed 2 fingers. Her head shook violently. "Twice. Just twice. Coffee last week when I ran into him at the gas station. And tonight. That's all." Her words hung in the air like smoke. Impossible to disperse. Impossible to breathe. Nancy looked like she wanted to bolt straight through the door, but her shoes might as well have been nailed to the floor. Her voice shook when she spoke, though the words were steady enough. "I asked him to meet me. I needed to tell him I'm doing better now." At the children's table, Andrew reappeared with a basket of breadsticks. He bent low, whispering to me, "On the house," before retreating to keep watch. I fetched juice boxes from behind the counter and set them down in front of the kids. They tore into the bread hungrily, proof that their mother's fury hadn't been exaggerated. These kids really hadn't eaten. 2 tables over, an elderly couple sat stiff-backed, openly watching the wreckage unfold. A pack of teenagers had their phones raised, recording every raw second for strangers to gawk at later. The air was thick with judgment, curiosity, pity. At the centre of it all, the man lifted his head from his hands. His eyes were swollen, rimmed red. His voice came out coarse, like gravel dragged over steel. "I lied about working late, both times." He gestured toward Nancy, who still hadn't moved from where she stood. "But nothing inappropriate happened. I swear on our kids' lives. I just wanted to know my sister again. I didn't know how to tell you without it turning into another war." His wife's tears finally spilled, unchecked. She didn't bother hiding them. Her voice broke clean in half. "How can I believe a single word? You looked me in the eye and lied. Twice." Across the restaurant, their middle child spotted her mother crying and bolted from the booth before I could stop them. They flung themselves into her waist, clinging like they were afraid she might vanish. The wife bent down, wrapping her arms around the small body, her breath hitching as she tried to compose herself. Nancy inched toward the door, but the wife's head snapped up, voice sharp and commanding. "Wait, don't you dare leave." Nancy froze, trembling. "You think you can just stroll back into our lives after the wreckage you left?" the wife hissed, voice steadier now, stronger. "After everything you destroyed?" Nancy drew a breath, shoulders squared though her hands trembled. Her voice was quiet, but it carried across the hushed room. "I've been sober 3 years. I know I ruined everything before, but I've been trying, God, I've been trying to make it right with everyone I hurt." The wife's arms folded across her chest, a barrier of bone and muscle. Her face hardened like stone. The husband wiped his sleeve across his eyes and finally found words. "She's been reaching out for months. I ignored her. I only said yes last week. Coffee once, and now tonight." His wife stared at him as though he'd spoken in a foreign tongue. Her mouth opened, then closed, searching for words that wouldn't come. The look on her face was something fragile, brittle, caught between betrayal and disbelief. She staggered back half a step, as if the ground beneath her had shifted. I carried the forgotten pizza box to the children's table, setting it down gently. The youngest was scribbling stick figures across the placemat, blissfully oblivious, while the middle child watched quietly. I cut the pizza into small squares, something easy for little hands. The oldest girl, though, fixed me with wide, worried eyes. Is Dad in trouble? She whispered, her voice cracking on the last word. I crouched to her level, forcing calm into my tone. The adults are just working some things out, I said, sliding the plate closer. Everything's going to be okay. A lie, maybe, but the kind a child needed. Andrew moved back to the main table, his voice low and deliberate as he told the wife the meal was covered. Do you want me to call someone? He asked gently. She shook her head, grabbing a napkin from the dispenser and blotting at her face, though the tears kept spilling. Near the kitchen doors, 6 servers had gathered, watching the family unravel like spectators at a tragedy. I waved them off, shooing them back into their stations. This family didn't need an audience. The wife turned back to Nancy, her voice sharp but controlled. What do you want from us? Nancy's eyes brimmed over, tears trembling on the edge. I just want my brother back, she whispered, and maybe a chance to meet my nieces and nephew. Her hand lifted weakly, gesturing toward the children's table. They don't even know I exist. The husband finally rose from the booth, shoulders hunched, his face raw as he turned to his wife. I'm done pretending she doesn't exist, the man said, his voice steadier now, carrying further than before. Our children have an aunt they don't even know because of something that happened 5 years ago. The wife's voice rose in an instant, ragged with fury. What about the $1,000 she never paid back? Heads turned at nearby tables. Customers shifted uncomfortably, pretending to eat while drinking in every word. What about the rent we missed because of her? The lights we had to live without? Her face was blotched red, streaked with fresh tears, her chest heaving with the weight of the memories. Nancy fumbled in her pocket and pulled out her phone. With trembling hands, she opened a banking app and turned the screen outward. Her voice cracked. I've been saving. I was afraid to reach out, but I almost have it all now. The wife snatched the phone and stared. For a heartbeat, the storm in her expression faltered, anger giving way to something else. Confusion, surprise, maybe even disbelief. At the children's table, the youngest squirmed, restless from sitting too long. Can we go home now? His voice carried, piercing the silence. I walked over, forcing a smile. Your parents will be ready real soon, I said softly. I crouched, opening the dessert case. How about some cookies while you wait? Their eyes lit up and 3 small heads nodded eagerly. Within minutes, chocolate chip cookies sat before them, and the middle child had smeared chocolate across her cheeks like war paint. Back at the main table, the husband edged closer, hand half extended to his wife, but she recoiled, refusing his touch. The restaurant had grown unnaturally quiet. People bowed their heads over plates, pretending not to watch while their ears strained for every word. Andrew hovered near the register, his jaw tight, ready to step in if this powder keg exploded again. Nancy looked hollow, arms wrapped tightly around herself, as though she were bracing against an invisible wind. The wife finally spoke, her voice trembling with control. 850, that's what you've saved. Nancy nodded, tucking the phone back into her apron. The oldest child finished her cookie and leaned over to help her little brother with his. The wife's eyes flicked to them, softening for a fleeting second, before swinging back to her husband and then to Nancy. For a long moment, no one breathed. The wife scrolled through the banking app, transaction by transaction, $20 here, $30 there, slowly adding up to $850. 10 different emotions rippled across her face as she absorbed it. Anger, doubt, sorrow, something like reluctant respect, while the dining room hung suspended in her silence. The husband took a step closer, desperate, but froze when she lifted her hand without even looking at him. The children grew restless again. The youngest tipped over his juice box, a small flood racing across the table. I hurried with napkins, blotting it up before it could drip to the floor. A mundane crisis against the backdrop of a family unraveling. Finally, the wife handed the phone back to Nancy. Her hand shook. She turned to her husband, then back to Nancy, then to him again. Her voice, when it came, was quiet but sharp enough to cut. "We need to talk about this somewhere else." He nodded, lowering his gaze. "Not here. Not with all these people staring." His voice was barely above a whisper. The wife's chin lifted, defiance returning to her tone. "She's not coming to our house." Nancy's eyes welled as she wiped at her face with the back of her hand. She unlocked her phone again, forcing her voice into steadiness. "I can meet you at the park tomorrow. Cash, if that's what you want." The wife hesitated, looking toward the children, now scribbling stick figures on napkins with the crayons I'd left them. After a long pause, she exhaled. "I'll think about it." Then, with shaky composure, she walked toward her kids. The wife bent down, slipping her youngest into a jacket and retrieving the stuffed animal that had been abandoned beneath the booth. The middle child clung stubbornly to a crayon, unwilling to leave her half-finished drawing, but their mother gently coaxed it from her fingers. The husband stepped forward to help gather them up, awkward and tentative, while Nancy remained behind, frozen, arms hugging herself like she'd been left behind on an unfamiliar shore. At the register, the husband pulled out his wallet, jaw tight with guilt. Andrew shook his head immediately. "It's covered," he said firmly. The man blinked, stunned, but forced a grateful nod before slipping a 20 into the tip jar anyway. Then, together but not united, the family walked out into the night. The children chattering questions their parents had no strength to answer, the wife's face still streaked with tears, the husband's shoulders hunched under the weight of silence. Slowly, the restaurant exhaled. Conversations resumed, forks scraped plates again, and the murmur of ordinary life crept back into the space. Nancy, however, crumpled. She collapsed into the booth where moments earlier her brother had sat, buried her face in her hands, and shook soundlessly. I poured a glass of ice water and carried it over, despite the chaos of the dinner rush. When I set it down, she lifted her head, mascara smeared in jagged black trails down her cheeks. I slid into the booth across from her. "That was brave," I said quietly. She let out a brittle laugh, more crack than humour. Her fingers trembled as she wrapped them around the glass. "I've pictured this moment for years," she whispered, voice raw from crying. "Rehearsed it 100 times, and it still went nothing like I imagined." She wiped at her face with a napkin, gaze drifting to the door where her brother's family had disappeared. "I thought just seeing him would be enough. Now I don't know if I've fixed anything, or broken it worse." Duty called me back to my section, but before I left, I reached across and gave her hand a small squeeze. She stayed there long after, staring at her phone, sipping water, hollowed out by hope and regret in equal measure. The next morning, I arrived early to prep for the lunch shift, and Nancy was already there rolling silverware. She looked wrecked, exhaustion pulling at her face, but beneath it flickered something fragile, almost excitement. She hurried over the moment she saw me. "She texted me," she said breathlessly, shoving her phone into my hands. On the screen was a short message. "Meet us at the park at noon. Bring the money in cash." Nancy had already been to the bank. She opened her purse and showed me an envelope stuffed with 20s and 50s. Her hand shook as she tucked it away again. She couldn't stand still, checking the clock every few minutes, fumbling through her prep like her body was moving without her mind. At 11:30, she asked if I'd cover her tables. I told her, of course, and watched her leave, her old Honda rattling out of the parking lot as though it carried every ounce of her hope inside it. Quietly, I whispered a prayer she'd find what she was looking for. The lunch rush hit like a wave, and I barely had time to breathe between her tables and mine. Hours blurred past in a storm of orders, refills, and impatient customers. 3 hours later, Nancy returned. Her eyes were red again, But this time, the tears hadn't hollowed her out. They had polished her. She was smiling, not the forced, brittle smile from before. This was something pure, almost luminous. She pulled me aside at the drink station and fumbled with her phone. "Look," she said, voice breaking with wonder. On the screen was a photograph. Nancy pushing a boy on a swing, his head thrown back in laughter, mouth wide open. "His mother took it," she whispered. "She actually took a picture of me with my nephew." She stared at that picture like it was treasure, like it was proof she wasn't invisible anymore. I wanted to say something profound, but the dinner rush was picking up again, and Andrew's eyes were already on me. So I smiled, squeezed her arm, and went back to work. Nancy worked the rest of that shift like she was lighter, brighter, her grin refusing to fade no matter how many orders piled up. For the first time, she didn't look lost. 3 days later, during the quiet lull of a lunch rush, the husband came back alone. He looked tired, almost deflated, and chose a small table by the window instead of a booth. When I walked over with my pad, he started apologizing before I could even ask for his order. When he sat down alone at a small table by the window, I half expected him to bolt before I even reached him. Instead, he lifted tired eyes and said quietly, "I'm sorry. I know we were just doing your jobs, and I dragged all my mess into your workplace." I told him it was fine, asked what he wanted. He ordered a small pizza and a water, then pulled out a laptop, screen glowing in front of him like a shield. He worked while he waited, tapping slowly, distractedly, the keys punctuated by heavy silences. When Andrew passed by, the man waved him over. He apologized again, his voice low. Andrew brushed it aside with a nod. "Families have problems sometimes. Don't beat yourself up." The words were steady, but there was something in Andrew's face, a mix of sympathy and the unspoken reminder that life always spills outside the neat boxes we try to keep it in. I brought the pizza, set it down. He barely glanced up from the screen. He ate with slow, mechanical bites, typing between swallows. And that's when I noticed. His wedding ring was gone. The absence was louder than anything he said. Halfway through, he called me over. His voice was uneven, almost brittle. "My wife, she's thinking about counselling. Together." He rubbed his forehead like he was trying to press the thought deeper into his skull. "The trust's gone, but she wants to try. For the kids." He didn't sound convinced, but I nodded, told him it was a good step. Maybe the only one. He came back 2 more times that week, always alone. Always with the laptop, like burying himself in work could delay the storm at home. Then, Thursday night, while Nancy worked dinner shift, her apron buzzed. She pulled her phone free, glanced down, and froze. Her face drained. She showed me the screen. A message from the wife. "Coffee? Just us." Nancy's hands trembled as she typed her reply. "Yes, I'll be there." Her co-workers urged her on, even as fear flickered across her face. She whispered questions. What to wear, what to say, whether she should bring something. One server told her gently, "Just be yourself. Listen more than you talk." She called in sick Friday, nerves eating her alive. By Saturday afternoon, she came by the restaurant even though it wasn't her shift. She stood in the doorway like someone bracing for judgment. Her eyes were puffy, but her voice carried a strange new steadiness. She was cold at first, Nancy said, frost in her eyes, but by the end, her voice cracked. We were both crying. The wife had asked questions, hard, relentless ones, about recovery, about the 5 lost years, about the promises Nancy had broken, and whether she had any left worth keeping. Nancy answered as best she could. They met again the following week, and again after that. By the 3rd meeting, Nancy's voice carried something fragile but alive. Hope. She's starting to see it, Nancy told me one night, wiping down menus with trembling hands. That addiction isn't just bad choices. It's sickness. She sees I'm not that same girl anymore. She's starting to believe me. 4 weeks after that brutal night in the restaurant, the family came in again, this time together. They asked for a corner booth, half hidden from the dining room. The children didn't hesitate. They bolted straight to Nancy, wrapping themselves around her legs. She crouched low, hugging them fiercely while the parents hung back, stiff and uncertain. The husband and wife sat on one side of the booth. Nancy slid into the opposite bench, children clambering into her lap, over her shoulders, anywhere they could fit. The silence was awkward at first. Words failed them. But the children filled the space. The youngest peppered Nancy with questions about her job, whether she got to eat pizza every day. The middle child proudly displayed crayon drawings collected since the park. The oldest sat quiet, eyes sharp, sneaking glances at her aunt as though trying to decide whether she was real or another promise destined to vanish. They ordered 2 large pizzas. The kids devoured them. The parents barely touched their slices. Halfway through, the wife approached me while I was wiping down a nearby table. Her voice was low, breaking. I need to apologize. For that night, for how I acted. I was scared and embarrassed. Her eyes glistened. There's nothing to apologize for, I told her gently. When she returned to the booth, something had shifted. I saw it instantly, her left hand, his right. Both carried rings again, gold glinting under the lights. For weeks they had been absent, stripped away like silent accusations. And now, they were back. I'd noticed, because I always noticed. Divorce leaves you with that habit, counting rings. The tension softened then, just a little. Nancy began folding napkins into swans, showing the children how. She handed one to each of them, delicate paper wings spread wide. The youngest squealed in delight. The middle child tried to mimic her, tongue poking out in concentration. The oldest struggled. Her swan collapsed into something limp and sad. Her frustration flared hot. Nancy slid beside her, guiding her hands with patience. Like this, fold, sharp, not soft, strong wings. Together, they crafted a swan. The girl cradled it carefully, carrying it from the booth as though it were fragile glass, her fingers curled protectively around the folds. For the first time that night, I saw something new in her face. Not suspicion, not anger. Wonder. After that night, the family began returning every other Sunday. It became a ritual, almost sacred in its own way. Always the same corner booth. Sometimes the meals were wrapped in silence so taut you could almost hear it hum. Other times, the children's laughter filled the space, and even the adults managed to trade words without bitterness. A few weeks in, another presence joined them, a woman named Jason, the counselor they'd been seeing. She carried herself with a calm that seemed to steady the air around her. When voices began to climb, she gently redirected. Let's pause here. Take a breath. What's something positive you've noticed this week? She asked questions that didn't just provoke answers, but reflection. The kids liked her instantly. She remembered their stories, their favourite subjects, the small triumphs of their week. They leaned toward her like she was a safe harbour. The Sunday after, the husband brought someone else, a tall man in a baseball cap who sat at the table like he'd belonged there all along. He grinned at the children, pulling quarters from behind their ears and making them shriek with laughter. This is Bradley, the husband explained. We grew up together, back when Nancy still lived at home. Bradley ordered a beer, then launched into stories of their teenage years. How he and the siblings built a go-kart out of shopping cart wheels and crashed it through a neighbour's fence, or the time they tried camping in the backyard and ended up running inside after hearing raccoons. For the first time in weeks, the wife actually smiled. Nancy relaxed too, the tension draining from her shoulders as Bradley's humour smoothed rough edges. When arguments threatened to spark, Bradley shifted the subject with practiced ease. Sports, school, anything that diffused the weight. 2 weeks later, Nancy came to work grinning, clutching an envelope. She had just gotten her first full paycheck since being promoted to shift supervisor. Half of it went straight into a separate account. "I'm giving her $500 this weekend," she told me, pride and nerves woven together in her voice. That Sunday, she slid the envelope across the table to her sister-in-law. The wife opened it, counted the bills twice, and slipped them into her purse without a word. She didn't thank her, but she didn't refuse either. I saw her shoulders fall, just slightly, as though a weight had been pried loose. The husband murmured to Nancy, "That'll help us catch up on the electric. 2 months behind." Week after week, Nancy arrived with another envelope. Week after week, the wife accepted them. Slowly, other cracks began to seal. One evening, the middle child asked, "Can Aunt Nancy come to my dance recital?" The wife hesitated, then gave a non-committal, "Maybe." But maybe was better than the silence of no. The oldest daughter wanted Nancy's help with a family tree project for school. The wife agreed, with conditions. It had to happen at the restaurant where she could watch. They spread poster board across the corner booth. Nancy guided the girl's hand as she drew branches, filling them with names, while the younger siblings coloured leaves. The wife, watching quietly from across the table, eventually leaned in. "You forgot your cousin, the one in Texas." By the end, the family tree sprawled across the page, and the girl clutched it like treasure, excited to show her class. The next week, the children were begging, "Can we spend a Saturday with Aunt Nancy?" The wife finally said yes, though her voice was firm. "Only somewhere public." Nancy suggested the Children's Museum downtown. The wife agreed, but made Nancy promise to text photos every hour. That Saturday morning, Nancy arrived in her old car, freshly washed, the seats cleared of every scrap and receipt. The kids piled in with backpacks packed by their mother, snacks and juice boxes tucked neatly inside. At the museum, time vanished. They marvelled at towering dinosaur skeletons, giggled through the pretend grocery store, and chased soap-light bubbles in the science wing. Nancy snapped photos constantly, smiling children, small triumphs, little hands busy building or creating, and sent each one to their mother. Proof. Reassurance. The youngest built a tower taller than himself in the construction zone, beaming with pride. The middle child painted a butterfly in the art corner, splashes of colour across her smock. And Nancy stood among them, no longer an outcast or a ghost, but an aunt reclaiming her place, one fragile hour at a time. The oldest child darted from one exhibit to the next that day at the museum, tugging Nancy along and firing off 100 questions about how everything worked. By the time they all piled back into the car, the kids were glassy-eyed with exhaustion, but their chatter was unstoppable. They spilled through the door at home, voices tumbling over one another as they described dinosaurs, bubbles, towers, and painted butterflies. For the first time in months, the husband and wife had been alone together. They looked calmer when the children returned, their edges softened. Something had shifted. The wife began watching Nancy differently after that. She noticed the way Nancy bent low with patience when the children grew restless, the way she lingered after shifts to close even when no one asked her to. She saw Nancy quietly slipping a portion of her tips into the pocket of a new server who was struggling with rent. And slowly, suspicion gave way to something else. Reluctant respect. One evening, the wife pulled me aside, her voice low and contemplative. "She's not the same person," she admitted. "Addiction stole her from us. But recovery gave us someone better." 6 weeks after that first volcanic eruption in the dining room, the family gathered again for their usual Sunday dinner. The youngest sat colouring while the pizza baked, glancing up at Nancy with wide, innocent eyes. "Can I have more crayons, Aunt Mel?" he asked. The table fell into silence. It was the first time any of the children had given her that name. Nancy's eyes shimmered instantly, tears spilling before she could blink them back. The wife reached across the table and squeezed her hand, just for a second, before retreating. The husband cleared his throat, blinking furiously, while Bradley broke the tension with a joking, "Who left the onions out in the kitchen?" From that moment, Aunt Mel stuck. All 3 children adopted it, testing it out with delight, and with each repetition, the word seemed to stitch something invisible back together. Other changes followed. The husband and wife began sitting closer in the booth. His arm stretched across the back of the seat behind her. She leaned in, just slightly, but enough. They exchanged small glances when the kid said something funny. Once I caught him press a kiss to her forehead when he thought no one was looking. The lies and betrayals had scarred them, but bit by bit, they were finding their way back. Around this time, we hired a new server, Tiffany, fresh out of rehab, fragile, nerves fraying at every edge. Nancy noticed immediately. She took Tiffany under her wing, guiding her through the chaos of service, covering mistakes before they became disasters. Tiffany clung to her steadiness. I overheard Nancy telling her quietly one afternoon, "I've been sober 3 years. Call me, day or night, if you ever feel like slipping." Tiffany started showing up early, just to talk with her before shifts. One afternoon, Nancy mentioned Thanksgiving. She said she didn't have plans. The children immediately erupted, begging, pleading for Aunt Mel to come to their house. The wife shook her head. "Too soon," she said. But Bradley suggested neutral ground. The park, food, football, open air. It seemed safer, less fraught than a home with memories still heavy in its walls. Even the wife considered it and, eventually, agreed. After 5 fractured Thanksgivings, maybe it was time to try again. The next Sunday, something remarkable happened. The wife apologized, out loud, right there in the corner booth. Her voice trembled but didn't waver. "I've been thinking a lot about the past. I was too harsh cutting you off completely. I was scared, angry. I had a newborn, 2 more kids, no money, and you stealing from us felt like the final straw. But now, I see it different. You were sick, you needed help, and I shut the door instead." The husband reached across and took her hand. For once, she didn't pull away. They spent the next hour laying out rules like bricks in a new foundation. Nancy would see the kids twice a month at first, always with both parents present. She'd keep paying the money back, but finances would no longer be a weapon between them. No more surprises. Plans would be shared in advance. Nancy agreed to it all. More than that, she suggested they exchange schedules so everyone felt included. It wasn't perfect, it wasn't simple, but for the first time it was something solid, something new. The children were bent over their placemats that night, crayons scratching, but I could tell by the tilt of their heads they were listening to every word their parents and aunts spoke. Words about rules, trust, new beginnings. They soaked it all in like sponges. 2 weeks later, the middle child burst through the restaurant doors, clutching a sheet of construction paper bigger than she was. She stopped every server on her way to the back, proudly holding it up before finding Nancy counting inventory. On the paper, in crooked letters, it read, "Happy Family Day, Aunt Mel." Stick figures filled the page, all of them hand in hand. Nancy's hands trembled as she took it. "Can I keep this forever?" she asked, her voice breaking. The little girl nodded so fiercely her pigtails bounced. Later, I saw Nancy carefully tape the card to her locker. She told me she was going to frame it, hang it in her apartment so it would be the first thing she saw each morning. And she did. Her brother mentioned later she'd already cleared a place on the wall. 3 months passed since that unforgettable night when everything unravelled in public view. The family still came every Sunday. They weren't perfect. Sometimes the wife's smile tightened when Nancy hugged the children. Sometimes shadows flickered in the husband's eyes. But they were trying. And that mattered. The husband had found his humour again, tossing out terrible dad jokes that actually made his wife laugh. The kids sprinted to Nancy every time, squealing as she scooped up the youngest and spun him around. They looked less like people enduring each other and more like something solid, a family being stitched back together. One quiet Tuesday, the husband came in alone. I was refilling salt shakers when he approached, awkward, hesitant. "I wanted to thank you," he said, voice thickening. "That night, you took care of my kids. You got them out of the mess. You calmed them down. You didn't have to do that." He swallowed hard, blinking fast. "Your kindness, in the worst moment of my life, meant more than I'll ever be able to say." When his meal was done, he left $50 on a $10 check. About a month later, Andrew gathered us before a shift. "Nancy's being promoted to shift supervisor," he announced. Applause erupted. She had worked harder than anyone, and she deserved it. Not 20 minutes later, the wife arrived with all 3 kids, each one holding a handmade poster covered in glitter, foam letters, and crooked hearts. The youngest kept spilling sparkles everywhere. The oldest lifted hers high with pride. Right there, in front of the whole staff, the wife hugged Nancy tight. "I'm proud of you," she whispered. The kids began chanting, "Aunt Mel, Aunt Mel," until customers joined in, clapping along. Nancy laughed and cried all at once, repeating, "I can't believe you came just for this." The wife smiled and said simply, "Family shows up for the important stuff." They weren't without struggles. Sometimes tension shadowed the air when bills or old wounds came up. But instead of slamming doors or hiding truths, they worked through it. I once saw them in the parking lot, heads bowed close together, speaking quietly while the children waited in the car. No shouting, no tears, just the hard work of rebuilding. When they returned inside, their hands were clasped. The children noticed too. The oldest nudged her sister and grinned. The last time I saw them all was on an ordinary Wednesday that became anything but. The youngest had just won a spelling bee. He marched in still wearing his medal, chest puffed out, telling anyone who'd listen how he'd spelled necessary when no one else could. They slid into their usual booth, ordered their usual pizza. He spread his arms wide to demonstrate the size of his trophy, and in the process knocked his water all over the table. But no one scolded him. The husband lunged for napkins, the wife moved the cups, Nancy knelt to blot his shirt while his sisters teased him. Soon, they were all laughing so hard, the father wiped tears from his eyes. The sound rolled through the restaurant, catching on strangers until other customers smiled with them. Their joy was contagious, and in that moment, they looked exactly like what they had become. Through fury, betrayal, tears, and fragile forgiveness, they looked like a real family. Sometimes, when I think back to that night, the mother storming in with her children in pajamas, her voice breaking like glass, I remember the weight of it, how easily everything could have shattered for good. But it didn't. Against all odds, it became something else entirely.